We did an experiment where we intentionally raised our heart rates, and I remember going out of kind of the clinic where I was working, we were just like running up and down the street to kind of, and we were doing it together, but to really kind of prompt that and really kind of the shortness of breath and really put ourselves in that place. This wasn't something we did immediately, so I just need to caveat that we did work up to it. But things like that, really kind of practical interventions were really helpful for clients, especially with anxiety.
Becoming a therapist, when did it first cross your mind? How old were you? What happened there?
I remember kind of being a teenager and really finding kind of small talk quite mundane and quite frustrating. And I really always kind of craved depth and kind of exploration. I always kind of had this sense of I didn't want to work in a corporate setting. I knew I wanted to work with people. I knew I didn't want all my days to look the same. I wanted it to be kind of a dynamic, relational. I had been a social worker. So I had done a graduate scheme and had a master's in social work. And I'd been introduced to kind of working therapeutically with people in that capacity. And CBT, as well as DBT actually, were some of the therapies and modalities that I was introduced to during that time. I was looking at a way to train and was just finding it financially a difficult thing to be able to navigate. And because of my, I guess, core profession qualification, which social work is considered a core profession, to things like kind of teaching, nursing, things like that are considered kind of core professions, I was suitable to apply for a training post within the NHS. It was part of kind of an initiative to improve access to psychological therapies for the general public. And CBT is very much at the forefront of that. It was at the time, I think probably still is. So that's kind of why that was the modality that was on offer. And I was always kind of drawn to CBT because I'd had some myself personally and really benefited from it. And so always had that at the back of my mind as well.
Do you mind saying in what way you benefited from it?
I was going through a period of quite kind of challenging anxiety and I didn't really understand what was happening. And so I was then signposted to my local kind of talking therapies. And I was then kind of offered kind of a time-limited intervention, like a set of sessions of CBT. And it really just revolutionized my understanding, really, of what I was experiencing. It really kind of put words to an experience. It felt incredibly validating. I felt like, oh gosh, I'm not alone in this. I was able to understand the cognitive processes I was experiencing, like what is worry, the type of thought, how it comes up, the what if statements that I'd experienced looking back now for quite a long time. And the one thing in particular that really, really resonated with me was understanding that it's kind of an intolerance to uncertainty. Because that's part of the CBT understanding of anxiety and worry in particular. And there was something so validating and normalizing about making that link of course, uncertainty is going to prompt that kind of response. And I think that in particular was really profound, and then moving me towards not being so fearful of the worry. So worrying about the worry. There are certain kind of features that are characteristic of CBT. So it is typically time limited, which means that typically there is kind of a set number of sessions. It is very much focused on the here and now. So there is kind of an understanding, particularly when you're formulating an issue with a client, an understanding of how the past has influenced the present, but it is very much about what's happening for you now and what can we do about that. The link between what am I thinking, what am I feeling, and what am I doing, and how does that potentially maintain my problem, and where are the bits at which I can intervene to kind of interrupt that cycle, that repetitive cycle. It's very much kind of about learning skills. I definitely had an expectation that it would be, very exploratory. And it is initially, but there is definitely kind of, you're working on goals and you're working towards an outcome. And for a lot of clients, I think that can feel quite containing, actually, that there's something I'm working towards. There are specific protocols for different kind of presenting issues. So there's kind of, for example, a protocol for social anxiety. There's a protocol for panic disorder. So it's kind of specific interventions for specific problems as well. One thing that I really developed over the years of practicing CBT was my own kind of style. I think sometimes there can be, understandably, kind of maybe a bit of frustration that CBT feels like a kind of a cookie cutter, like here are your 6 sessions. But I really was able to develop my own style, own way of delivering it that made it kind of come alive. And I think that's something I would really encourage people to hold in mind when they approach CBT.
So what would you say characterizes your style?
For me, I prioritize the relationship with the client. And that's been kind of the biggest tool for change that I've seen in my work, regardless of the modality. And there's so much research out there that kind of backs this up, that regardless of the modality, it is the relationship. That's the one thing that kind of makes the most difference. So that would be my approach. And it would be also kind of trying to, this actually came from DBT, but trying to really internalize the belief that people are doing the best that they can. So, the client in front of you is doing the best that they can with what they have, and really kind of seeing your intervention with them as you're kind of working together as a team. Yeah. So that would be kind of my approach, my style.
What were some other examples of kind of aha moments that you had while you were training where something kind of clicked?
Understanding what PTSD and trauma actually is was, again, very was eye-opening, really, and really understanding that anxiety is at the root. It is considered an anxiety, PTSD in particular I'm talking about, is considered kind of an anxiety disorder. And just understanding that it comes from a fear. Again, it was something about linking those two things and not seeing them as separate was really helpful in then how I approach my work with clients with that presentation. I think particularly around like understanding the kind of symptoms of like hypervigilance, and then the beliefs that would come up for people. That was, again, kind of seeing it on a spectrum, I guess, as a spectrum kind of anxiety, and all these kind of different presentations having kind of a core. That was really helpful.
Can you give an example of one of those, or how that understanding would then apply in practice with someone?
I guess one thing that you would always do would be to do some psychoeducation, particularly around trauma and anxiety with a PTSD client. So that would be one way in which you'd make all of these links and present that kind of to them and explore that with them, which I think can feel very validating for clients that have been through something traumatic, because it really does skew your perception of the world as well as yourself and other people. Pulling that out and kind of making it explicit can be really helpful in the initial stages. For example, like hearing a siren and their heart starts beating, and normalizing that and kind of understanding, well, it makes sense that would happen because X, Y, and Z. Things like behavioural experiments and exposure generally is really useful for any kind of anxiety, anything that we're fearful of. So that would, for example, that might look like, let's say there's somewhere that you're avoiding because of a kind of a past experience there, or there's kind of a catastrophic interpretation of what might happen if you were to go to that place. It would be working gradually, but working on exposing to that. And one thing I really liked about behavioural experiments is that you could be really creative with them. So it's also kind of exposure to internal sensations as well as external stimuli. So, for example, let's say you had someone that was experiencing kind of panic symptoms and tolerating like a rapid heartbeat prompted kind of catastrophic interpretations of what might happen. It was gently exposing to that. So I remember once working with a client who found that sensation particularly difficult. And we did an experiment where we intentionally raised our heart rates. And I remember going out of kind of the clinic where I was working, we were just like running up and down the street to kind of, and we were doing it together, but to really kind of prompt that and really kind of the shortness of breath and really put ourselves in that place. This wasn't something we did immediately, so I just need to caveat that we did work up to it. But things like that, really kind of practical interventions were really helpful for clients, especially with anxiety.
Yeah, that word practical definitely kind of sums it up in a way for me, because the idea, even when you said psychoeducation, that you would actually try and teach a client about what's going on for them because in another style, another way of thinking, the belief is that they only know what's going on, and your job is to help them understand that for themselves.
I think sometimes that can be misinterpreted as like, you don't know. And this is something that I make clear at the beginning when I'm working with clients within a CBT model. I don't know what their experience is. They're the ones that are going to tell me, and we're in this together. And so I bring my knowledge and expertise in CBT and kind of the practice of it and the principles and the interventions, and they bring their expertise in themselves and their emotional experiences. And so we work on it together. So I don't want I've never wanted it to feel like it's kind of didactic and I'm saying X, Y, and Z is happening to you. There always should be, in my opinion, space for a client to say, actually, that doesn't resonate, or that does resonate. But yes, you're right. It is a lot more, I guess, there's more scaffolding. There's more kind of facilitation in that way. Yeah.
It's very prescriptive in a way. There's a protocol for certain things that's very clear. There's ways of working with people that are well known and also have a proven efficacy. Comparing that to something like psychodynamic psychotherapy, which has less scaffolding around it, even though it has a lot of history and everything, they're quite different in that way.
Absolutely. And the depth of kind of work that you go into as well. Like I said, CBT is very present focused. That's different to other modalities that would maybe explore the past potentially a bit more. Yeah, and I guess the positioning of the therapist is potentially different in different modalities as well. So yeah, like I'm jumping to like DBT now, but in DBT there is an element of appropriate and relevant self-disclosure, whereas that wouldn't necessarily be something that would happen if you were psychodynamically kind of trained or delivering a psychodynamic intervention.
What would you say to people who were doing, like I am, more of an integrative course that would be something about CBT that was really worth understanding and really worth learning?
I think it's worth learning how to effectively help clients deal with the symptoms of their difficulties. You're not going to necessarily heal kind of a childhood wound with a behavioural experiment or cognitive modification, and at the same time it does improve people's quality of life in the present moment. And sometimes clients need that to then be able to access things in the past, or kind of work on whatever it is that's maybe at a greater depth. So I would say that it's incredibly worthwhile learning what depression and anxiety and all of these other kind of presentations are, like what happens when we experience it physically, cognitively, behaviorally, and what are some practical kind of skills and interventions that can be offered to help people ease those symptoms so that they can access other things that they might want to be accessing.
In my own therapy at one stage, there were two main projects that were working in parallel with each other. And I had at that time anxiety disorder as well. And so our first project was really to try and get the root of what was causing that. But the second project was to equip me with tools to help me manage my anxiety day to day that meant I could then go on public transport, or that meant I could then maybe sit in a restaurant and not have to leave.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you had that experience. It sounds like it was quite complementary. That is the case for a lot of people. I think there's something about, for me anyway, being motivated by supporting people to kind of relieve immediate suffering. They might already be in pain, but they don't have to be suffering. So I think CBT and DBT are really helpful in kind of trying, CBT in particular with kind of symptoms that are causing suffering, kind of relieve those.
How could you put in a nutshell what DBT is?
DBT is considered, or when it emerged, it was considered what's called a third wave CBT intervention. So kind of an offshoot. So it kind of used principles from CBT and kind of emerged then at the time as a specific treatment for emotional dysregulation, and more specifically borderline personality disorder, or what's now kind of called EUPD, so emotionally unstable personality disorder, and people that had recurrent kind of suicidal ideation or self-harming behaviours. So it's kind of seen as the treatment for that. So that's kind of the context of it. So DBT stands for Dialectical Behavioural Therapy, and it is very dialectical in that there's a lot of marrying of different kind of concepts. It is kind of a complementary and dynamic relationship between kind of Western psychological ideas and Zen Buddhist practice. And the kind of creator, I guess, of DBT is a psychologist called Marsha Linehan, and she herself struggled with symptoms of borderline personality disorder, and was a psychologist at the same time, and so found, I guess, relief from her own suffering in this intervention, which she then formalized as a treatment program. But yes, it's very much about kind of marrying acceptance strategies and change strategies. So the 4 modules in DBT are mindfulness, interpersonal effectiveness, distress tolerance, and emotion regulation. And each of them have their own set of skills within that. Again, it is very structured, so it's very much inspired by CBT. It is time limited, although it is at a longer, over a longer period of time than a CBT kind of intervention would typically be. And there are kind of 3 aspects to the treatment. So there's the individual therapy sessions, the group sessions, and then the coaching is often available. And there's a lot around the relationship between the therapist and the client, and that being something that is really prioritized. And kind of in thinking about the difference between, myself as a CBT therapist and myself as a DBT therapist, I definitely feel able to put a lot more of my personal self into kind of my DBT work, and then kind of in comparison to my CBT work. So I mentioned earlier, there was a sense of having appropriate and relevant self-disclosure if that is going to facilitate the learning of a skill with a client. So kind of sharing something about myself potentially with a client. And there are often, there's always assumptions we kind of sign up to as DBT therapists about ourselves and about clients. So the one about people are trying their best, that's a DBT assumption, and they need to try better. So everything's a kind of an and, there's no but. So it's very dialectical, very quite philosophical, actually, which is something I wasn't expecting when I started my training.
How many clients do you work with at one time?
So within the DBT model, because of the, the kind of the risk of the potential risk that clients present, it wouldn't be more than 8.
Okay. And what do you mean by the risk they present?
So DBT is what would be called kind of a treatment that's available in kind of secondary care. So people can't just refer themselves for it. So it isn't like kind of CBT, which is available in primary care. So people have been struggling quite significantly. And that often means having attempted suicide or actively self-harming. So in terms of kind of risk presentation, risk considerations around their safety is much, much higher than you would have or kind of encounter in a primary care setting.
So what is it that makes DBT particularly suited to high risk as opposed to something like CBT?
I think there's a few things. I think there's a really thorough and robust suicide protocol. So that's, you're trained in that and you're trained to deliver that, off the bat, really. You kind of positioned to, that's why people are there. So you're positioned to talk about that stuff right from the start. There's also kind of the option in a lot of DBT services for clients to have what's called coaching. So outside of, it's quite unique, I think, to DBT. So outside of kind of their regular therapy session, individual therapy session and group session, they can contact you for a coaching call. So that would be kind of a 10-minute call. Typically, if they are experiencing kind of a crisis or they're really trying to use their skills and they need support with that. So that's the other kind of way it's set up to be quite robust. And in terms of like how the team is kind of devised, is you don't hold a client individually. So it's not like your sole responsibility to work with that client. It's like a team responsibility. And so I think that can help as well with managing risk and other kind of issues.
And is the team like multidisciplinary, or is it all just other DBT therapists working with the same client?
So in terms of kind of clinical work, it is just kind of DBT therapists. However, kind of where I sit and where most other DBT services sit in kind of the NHS anyway, is within a community mental health team, and that's interdisciplinary. So that will have kind of psychiatrists, social workers, psychiatric nurses, OTs, all sorts. But the clinical work is kind of done with other therapists and psychologists. Clients will present with multiple kind of challenges. And so, I'm thinking of some of the work I've done, and there's definitely things like eating disorders in that, and you definitely need someone to be monitoring the kind of physical health of the client as well. So yeah, you wouldn't take on any of that without that support.
Can you talk about the role of mindfulness in DBT?
In the context of DBT, it comes from Zen Buddhist practice. So Marsha Linehan, the kind of original kind of creator of DBT, is also a Zen master. And she found a lot of relief from her own symptoms through mindfulness practice. In the context of DBT and how it's delivered in the kind of the modern day, it is very much a secular approach to mindfulness. Although if kind of a client has particular spiritual beliefs that they want to incorporate, there is space for that for them. But specifically, it's about understanding our relationship with our thoughts and our experience and our sensations and our emotions. It's very much about kind of developing an awareness. It tends to be, in my experience, it tends to be the module that clients start off liking the least. And I have found I've got to do a lot of work to kind of convince people to give it a go, because I think there has sometimes been potentially a misunderstanding as to what mindfulness is. And I think people get to the point of entering DBT having had many kind of crisis experiences and feeling like they've been told that they need to just practice mindfulness, which I'm sure is not the intention to kind of be dismissive, but I think they've experienced it as potentially dismissive. So there's a lot of work around actually clarifying what mindfulness is. And there are specific mindfulness skills. We talk about kind of skills in DBT, so specific skills that we look at. There is kind of what you do when you're doing mindfulness, so the what skills, and then you've got the how skills. Firstly, observing. That's the first step, observing what is happening. What am I thinking? What am I feeling? What am I seeing? Then you are describing, so you're putting words to your experience. So taking what comes in through your senses and putting words to that experience. And then there is kind of a participation as another mindfulness skill. So kind of observing, describing, and then fully participating in the moment, regardless of what is coming up or what might be pulling you away from it. So kind of being present. And then you've got the how skills, which is how you do mindfulness, like the attitude at which you bring to your mindfulness skills, your kind of mindfulness what skills. So these things like practicing mindfulness mindfully, so doing one thing at a time, practicing it non-judgmentally. So it is about, how do I learn to accept my reality to then be able to do something about it? And that can be very challenging if everything about our reality feels unbearable.
Mindfulness is definitely one of those words that's come enough into the public consciousness for people to have an idea about what it is. And I can definitely see how, in the face of moderate or severe symptoms, it would seem like a very weak antidote to that. Whereas in another context, it can be incredibly powerful and transformative for people. So I can imagine how that would be difficult maybe for you to bring through as a way of helping someone when they may have firstly had their own ideas about it and then maybe tried it and it's just like, this isn't working at all. But that doesn't mean it can't in the future.
Absolutely, yeah. And I always stress this with clients when I'm delivering kind of a DBT intervention, these skills are theirs to make their own. So they will find their way of kind of practicing, let's say, mindfulness skills that works for them. And sometimes we have to make adaptations. Sometimes people have trauma histories where certain things are very difficult. So thinking about kind of trauma-informed approaches to mindfulness. Sometimes people present with a kind of neurodiversity, and that might make aspects of mindfulness challenging. So thinking about the adaptations that might be needed to be made for them. And So I really kind of stress that they can make it their own. I always want to give them a good grounding in the skill and an understanding of what it can offer them, and then encourage them to apply it in ways that work for them.
With the coaching and the group work, how do they work alongside the individual work with the therapist?
Clients have individual therapy session once a week, and then they have a group skills session also weekly. So it's kind of two kind of weekly therapy sessions. The individual session is 50 minutes to an hour, and the group skills session is 2 hours and a half. So it is quite an intensive intervention. In the individual therapy, that is your space to explore and go into detail about kind of your what's called a biosocial model, so kind of experiences in the past that have influenced what's happening for you in the present, kind of details of kind of your personal life, and anything that's kind of coming up for you. So it's kind of that intimate therapeutic space to explore all of that in detail. Group skill session isn't group therapy, as kind of sometimes is mistakenly understood. It's more of kind of an educational context. It's a bit like a seminar where people come and they learn DBT skills, and it's their chance to practice. And it's also very structured. So we start with a mindfulness practice, we do homework review, we have a break, and then we have kind of the skills teaching and the skills practice. The coaching is something that's available as and when, and that's often agreed between the therapist and the client. So the therapist might have specific kind of coaching hours where they're available. So you kind of agree that with your client ahead of time. It's typically kind of boundary to a 10-minute coaching call. They have to have tried using their DBT skills and not kind of just called in a crisis. So really encouraging them to practice those skills, particularly if you're looking at targeting what's called problem behaviours in DBT. So things like suicidal behaviour or self-harm behaviour. They can't have engaged in any of that prior to calling you. If they have, they're not offered the opportunity to get in touch with you for 24 hours. It can sometimes sound like a punitive aspect, and it's not meant to be received like that. And I explore that quite openly with clients, because sometimes they do feel it is a bit punitive. And so we kind of explore the basis. We look at, it is a dialectical behavior therapy. There is a lot of behavior. We look at how behavior is reinforced. And so we don't want to reinforce behavior that we're trying to change. And so what we want to do is reinforce people using their skills, regulating their emotions, attempting to do that, and then seeking support, rather than potentially relying on kind of old coping mechanisms of escalating their distress to then receive support. Yeah, so that would be more kind of, it's about what's reinforced.
What are some examples of the group skills and exercises that you do in session? And can you share an example of how that has been transformative for someone?
One of the first skills that people learn in DBT is something called the TIPP Skill. So there's a lot of acronyms. And TIPP skills, there's 4 skills within this. So that's temperature, intense exercise, paced breathing, and paired muscle relaxation. And the principle, the concept behind this is that we can, when we're experiencing kind of an intense level of distress, so we're feeling emotions really, really intensely, and we might not know what to do with them, the first step is just bringing the intensity down. And the TIPP skill kind of does that through changing your body chemistry. So it says, do something with your body to change how you're feeling so that the emotion you're experiencing reduces in intensity. So that is kind of one of the first skills that people learn in DBT. One aspect of this would be, for example, the T, which is kind of tipping the temperature, which is essentially kind of cold water immersion. So kind of there's a bit of science behind it, but essentially it's using the dive reflex to kind of switch part of the brain that is working to then reduce the intensity of emotion. So that would kind of include basically submerging a part of like the face in water and holding your breath for a few seconds to start with. And there are caveats. Obviously, if people kind of have heart conditions or health problems, then we can make adaptations to that. Yeah, just need to highlight that. And so that would be something that we would kind of, we go through the theory of it. Why does it work? How are people feeling about the skill? Are they noticing any what we call willfulness or kind of resistance coming up? What's that about? anything that we might need to bear in mind or adaptations we might need to make. And then we encourage people to practice it, and we practice it with them often. And so for clients that, kind of as an example, hypothetically, clients that are experiencing kind of significant distress that potentially might lead to problem behavior like self-harm, we'd encourage them to use their distress tolerance skill, their TIPP skill first, to reduce the intensity of what they're feeling, to kind of, I guess, interrupt the typical, what up until that point has potentially been the kind of typical coping strategy. So clients have kind of fed back that it does work. They feel different. It doesn't solve their problems, and we always stress that that's not the point of distress tolerance. It's an acceptance skill, but it's kind of a stepping stone to then using other skills to solve their problems. So something like that. So very practical. There are more abstract, potentially, or kind of maybe more kind of philosophical skills. So one called radical acceptance, which comes from Zen Buddhism, which can feel for some people a lot trickier. And that one, you think kind of jointly about how people can apply it to their lives as well.
Yeah, because that sounds like the sort of thing as well that needs to be met in the right spirit and also practiced maybe for the first time in the right context for it to be really effective for them to understand why it's helpful. I found it really interesting when you were talking about the T from TIPP. So I was wondering if you could explain the I and the P and the P.
So the I is intense exercise. So kind of similar concept. All of these are about using your body to change your emotions fast, is essentially the point, is that your distress tolerance skills, so this comes under the category of the umbrella of distress tolerance. This would be for when you are experiencing intense emotions in a crisis. It's about, I need something quickly, what's going to work? This is what you go to. So intense exercise is, as it says on the tin, doing something intensely that raises your heart rate. Depending on the emotion you're experiencing, sometimes people find this very effective, sometimes less so, depending on what's going on for them. But something like, let's say you're feeling really, really angry and you're about to do something that's probably not the most effective thing. It would be, okay, can I go and do some intense exercise, reduce what's happening physically as well as emotionally, and then come back and deal with the issue. So that would be the I. The first P is pace breathing, which essentially is kind of like breathing in and then breathing out, but it's breathing out for longer and slower. And sometimes there can be adaptations made to this. So I find it particularly effective to use with clients, kind of getting them to also kind of like lower their shoulders as they do that, teaching them to kind of almost like blow out as if they're blowing through a straw. So it's kind of a bit of psychoeducation here as well around the breath, breathing from the belly, not the chest, which often exacerbates kind of emotion. So that would be that, and it's kind of teaching them how to do that. And then paired muscle relaxation. Essentially, it's kind of tensing and releasing different muscle groups and really kind of focusing on that. So two of them are about up-regulating, two of them are about kind of down-regulating, and they're all about reducing intensity of emotion.
Makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you think about the role of exercise in people's lives generally for alleviating stress, emotional regulation in general. And I was also thinking and amusing myself by remembering when I was feeling anxious that I used to sometimes do star jumps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you practice intense exercise.
Because I thought, it's me sitting still is making it worse. So what can I do right now, which is going to change that situation for me?
It can sometimes sound so self-evident, but actually, we have to kind of recognize that when we're in that, when we're experiencing intense emotions, that part of our kind of brain, that our mind is not online. So it is going to be hard to kind of think, oh, you know what, a good thing would be to go and do this thing. So yeah, it can be very challenging to apply. And like you said, it can be really, really beneficial. And again, it's linking how we feel kind of internally, emotionally, with how we feel physically, and how that influences what we're thinking and what we're doing, which kind of is the CBT origin of it as well. So it's all about developing kind of emotional self-awareness as well as skills to regulate.
What do you find to be your favourite part of the process? If you have like 12 sessions, for example, or 6 sessions?
Two main bits that I enjoy. I enjoy the the kind of the formulation aspect, which would be kind of potentially well, probably not first, but like second, third session, where you're formulating their issue. So really, you get a real flavour for who they are, what they've been through, what they're going through, what might help. And so, and that's where you also get to provide a bit of psychoeducation and really check out with them if that's working for them. So that really feels like a joint enterprise. You need each other in that. So I really, really like that bit. And then I also particularly fond of behavioural experiments. And it's interesting because during my training, we were presented with a piece of kind of research that said that CBT therapists actually try to, avoid doing behavioural experiments. And so when I heard that, I was like, right, I'm gonna make sure that this is my thing. And I've got to, I've been able to I've had some fantastic clients who've been really willing to do so many different kinds of behavioural experiments. And you can get, like I said, really creative with them. Someone has a phobia, let's say, of vomit, for example. You can work on exposing to vomit and, making fake vomit and all sorts of stuff. Yeah. So I know it sounds a bit mad, but you can get really creative with what you do and how you do it. And it is a really very kind of precise and very kind of powerful intervention doing something like that.
Can you share any examples of other behavioural exercises you're really proud of?
Mm-hmm. So making vomit was a big one. And yeah, there have been a few others, exposing to the sensation of like blushing. And so kind of going out into, this is something I did with a client, and kind of going out into a shopping, a kind of supermarket with basically like lots and lots of blush on to kind of stimulate that sense of kind of blushing. Anything that was kind of exposing around kind of physical sensations or kind of appearance. So that'd be another one. With kind of panic, there can be sometimes a fear of losing control of your bowels. So going out and walking on the street with kind of, I use water to like wet my trousers, but essentially walk out as if you've kind of, lost control, and exposing to that. Eating in public, eating on public transport, another one. Making mistakes on purpose. This was one I kind of I did a few times, putting kind of purposeful errors in like emails or messages, or getting something wrong when speaking to a colleague, to kind of get exposed to that. So yeah, lots of different experiments. But yeah, you can get as creative as you want.
Are you able to share a story of a time when you have found a treatment process particularly difficult, or if you felt really stuck with someone, and how you managed to overcome that?
My experience seems to be that is a very natural part of treatment. Behaviours that you were kind of working on targeting at the beginning almost kind of resurface, or there's a sense of maybe willfulness, potentially from the therapist as well, because we don't kind of exclude ourselves from any of this behaviour either. So we kind of think about what are we doing in that kind of dynamic. I take it to what's called my DBT consult. So that would be the weekly team meeting, it's considered therapy for the therapist. So you work with and you speak with your colleagues at this meeting, and you kind of, you be radically genuine. This is what's happening. This is where I'm kind of feeling stuck. And your colleagues really kind of help you tease out what's going on, what you might be doing that's contributing to that. What you could do to change, how can you approach it, gets you to think a little bit more dialectically about what's going on rather than kind of seeing it as all or nothing, which is something we encourage everyone to move away from. So I think consult and then individual supervision are the places where I've taken this, and it's really helped me move through that with clients. What often kind of comes out of that is to speak directly with the client and notice that with them, and kind of see that as something that you problem solve together.
And are there any new ideas that have come through in the last few years maybe that have informed DBT or CBT?
There's a lot of kind of conversations and work and reflection around adapting DBT, adapting CBT to certain kind of demographics, groups, experiences. So so currently, for example, in DBT, there's a lot of work looking at neurodiverse clients and how we kind of adapt the intervention to be helpful to them. Someone has ADHD, for example, and they might need some kind of background noise. It would be, okay, yeah, you can have the radio on, or you can have a white noise playlist, or fidget toys, or you can bring stuff to group to help you focus. There's a diary card that every client fills out, and so that we've made adaptations to the diary card for people that maybe struggle, because it can, for some, feel very kind of text heavy and very kind of conceptual. So it's kind of, can we use images instead of like words? So it does depend, but things like that.
What's one idea from DBT that you think would make a profound difference to society if it was more widely understood?
For me, it would be the idea of dialectics and dialectical thinking and behaviour. Really kind of the core of DBT, which is the idea that there isn't a singular truth. There's not one objective. It's kind of, there's multiple versions of the truth, and that things are both and, not either or. And I think having that approach to life moves us away from, I think it has often been termed like the danger of a single story. So it moves us away from that and allows for a flexibility of interpretation, a generosity, I think, of interpretation of other people, the world, ourselves, which can often be the hardest part of it. So I think if people, or if the world took a dialectical approach to things, there would be less extremes. And that's the kind of spirit of DBT, is how do I move away from extremes and find the middle way in life.